The stagecoach wheels thundered along the mountain pass as Caroline Wallace gripped the wooden seat beneath her, watching the sheer drop just yards away from the rutted trail, her heart hammering against her ribs as she silently prayed they would make it safely to Cheyenne, Wyoming before nightfall in this summer of 1878. She had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago, responding to an advertisement for a schoolteacher in the growing frontier town, and now she wondered if she would even arrive alive to take up the position. The driver, a grizzled man named Hutchins, kept urging the 4 horses faster, apparently eager to make up time after their late departure from the last station. Caroline glanced at her fellow passenger, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson who had fallen asleep despite the jarring ride, her head bobbing with each bump and sway. The mountain air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Caroline had never seen landscape like this, the towering peaks still capped with snow even in July, the valleys below carpeted in green that seemed to stretch forever. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, so different from the ordered streets and brick buildings she had known her entire 22 years. Her mother had begged her not to come west, but Caroline had felt suffocated in St. Louis, trapped in a life that held no adventure, no possibility beyond becoming some merchant's wife and fading into the same mundane existence her mother had endured. The crack of the driver's whip echoed across the mountainside, and the horses picked up speed. Caroline felt a flutter of unease. They were going too fast for such a dangerous road. She leaned toward the window, about to call up to Hutchins, when a sharp sound split the air. Gunshot. The horses screamed in terror, their neighs high-pitched and panicked. Caroline's stomach dropped as the stagecoach lurched violently to the left, the wheels on one side lifting briefly off the ground before slamming back down. Mrs. Henderson jerked awake with a cry of alarm. "Hold on!" Hutchins roared from above, but his voice carried a note of fear that made Caroline's blood run cold. The horses were bolting now, completely out of control, their hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth as they raced along the cliff edge. Through the window, Caroline could see nothing but empty air and the valley floor hundreds of feet below. One wrong move, one misstep, and they would plunge over the side. Mrs. Henderson was screaming, her fingers digging into Caroline's arm. The stagecoach swayed dangerously, tilting toward the cliff as the panicked horses pulled them closer and closer to the edge. Caroline could hear Hutchins shouting, hear the desperate sawing of the reins, but the horses were beyond reason, driven mad with fear. Then, through the cloud of dust and the thunder of hooves, Caroline saw him. A man on horseback burst from the tree line ahead, riding hard toward the runaway team. He was massive, broad-shouldered, and powerfully built, his long dark hair streaming behind him as he leaned low over his horse's neck. He wore buckskin clothing and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to these mountains, who knew them as intimately as his own heartbeat. Caroline watched in breathless horror and hope as the man drove his horse alongside the lead pair of the stagecoach team. He was shouting something she could not hear over the chaos, his deep voice commanding. The stagecoach lurched again, the right wheels skidding on loose gravel near the cliff's edge, and Caroline felt the sickening sensation of the vehicle beginning to tip. The man did not hesitate. With a movement so fluid it seemed impossible, he launched himself from his saddle onto the back of the nearest led horse. His arms wrapped around the animal's neck as his powerful legs found purchase, and even through her terror, Caroline marveled at the sheer strength it must have taken to make such a leap and hold on. The horse he had been riding veered away, well trained enough to clear the path. The stranger now rode the panicked stagecoach horse, his muscled arms visible through his buckskin shirt as he fought to control the terrified animal. He grabbed for the harness, pulling himself forward with incredible strength until he could reach the lead horse's bridle. Whoa, his voice was like thunder, deep and commanding, carrying an authority that seemed to cut through the animal's panic. "Easy now, easy." His large hands seized the bridle, and he threw his weight backward, muscles straining visibly as he fought against the momentum of 4 terrified horses and a loaded stagecoach careening toward disaster. The lead horse's head came around, forced by the iron grip and unshakable determination of the man who now controlled it. The other horses, feeling the leader slow, began to respond. The stranger kept talking, his voice a steady rumble of calm authority that somehow penetrated the animal's fear. Caroline held her breath, still gripping the seat so hard her knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Henderson had buried her face in Caroline's shoulder, unable to watch. Slowly, impossibly, the team began to slow. The stagecoach stopped swaying quite so violently. The wheels found more solid ground, pulling away from the cliff's edge inch by precious inch. The stranger continued his firm control, bringing the horses from a terrified gallop to a canter. then a trot, then finally, blessedly, to a trembling halt. The sudden stillness was almost as shocking as the chaos had been. Caroline could hear the horses breathing hard, could hear Mrs. Henderson's quiet sobbing, could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. Dust settled around them like a curtain falling on some terrible stage performance. "Everyone all right in there?" The stranger's voice called out, still slightly breathless from his exertion. Caroline found she could not speak. Her throat had closed up, her body shaking with the aftershock of near death. Mrs. Henderson managed a weak affirmative sound. The stagecoach door swung open, and Caroline found herself looking up into a face that seemed carved from the very mountains around them. The man was perhaps 30 years old, with strong, weathered features, a square jaw darkened by several days' worth of beard, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His long dark hair fell past his shoulders, tangled from the wind and his desperate ride. But it was his build that truly struck her. He was enormous, not just tall but powerfully muscled, his chest broad beneath the buckskin shirt, his forearms corded with strength as he reached up to help her down. "Can you step out, miss? Need to check the coach for damage before we go any farther." His hand was steady as he offered it to her, and Caroline placed her trembling fingers in his palm. His grip was warm and solid, calloused from hard work but gentle as he helped her descend from the stagecoach. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched solid ground, and his other hand came up instantly to steady her, gripping her waist with a touch that was protective and careful. "I have you," he said quietly, those storm-gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch for an entirely different reason than fear. "You are safe now." Caroline nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close he was even more imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders impossibly broad. He smelled of pine and leather and something clean like mountain air. There was a quiet strength in everything about him, from the way he held himself to the calm assurance in his voice. He helped Mrs. Henderson down next, treating the older woman with the same careful courtesy, before checking on Hutchins. The driver had climbed down from his perch, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Zachariah," Hutchins breathed, shaking his head in wonder. "That was the damnedest thing I ever saw. Thought we were dead for certain." Zachariah, so that was his name. Caroline watched as he moved around the stagecoach, checking the wheels and axles with practiced efficiency. His movements were economical and sure, those of a man completely comfortable in his environment and his abilities. "What spooked them?" Zachariah asked, his deep voice carrying easily. "Gunshot," Hutchins replied. "Came from up in the rocks somewhere. Did not see who fired it." Zachariah's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping the surrounding cliffs and tree line with sudden alertness. "Could have been hunters, or it could have been someone meaning to rob the stage. Either way, we need to get you folks moving again. This is not a good place to linger." He returned to where Caroline stood, still shaky but determined not to show it. "Are you hurt at all, miss? Any injuries?" "No," Caroline managed to say, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "No, I am fine, thank you. You saved our lives." Something flickered in those gray eyes, though his expression remained controlled. "Just happened to be in the right place, or the right wrong place, depending on how you look at it. You live up here in these mountains?" Mrs. Henderson asked, having recovered somewhat from her fright. "I do," Zachariah confirmed, turning his attention to the older woman. "Have a cabin about 5 miles north of here. Was checking my trap lines when I heard the commotion." "A mountain man, then? A trapper?" Caroline had heard of such men, solitary souls who made their living from the wilderness, but she had never expected to meet one, much less be rescued by one. She found herself studying him with curious fascination, this man who seemed as much a part of the landscape as the towering pines and jagged peaks. "We are bound for Cheyenne," Caroline said, finding her voice growing stronger. "I am meant to be the new school teacher there." Zachariah's gaze returned to her, and she thought she saw a flicker of interest in his expression before he masked it. "Cheyenne is a good town, growing fast. They will be lucky to have you." The simple words, delivered in that deep, calm voice, sent an unexpected warmth through Caroline's chest. She dropped her eyes, suddenly self-conscious under his steady regard. "The team is still pretty shaken up," Zachariah said, addressing Hutchins again. "If you are agreeable, I will ride along with you the rest of the way into Cheyenne. Make sure there is no more trouble." Hutchins looked immensely relieved. "I would appreciate that more than I can say, Zachariah. These folks would too, I reckon." "Very much so." Mrs. Henderson agreed fervently. Zachariah nodded, then walked to where his own horse stood waiting patiently. The animal was a sturdy buckskin gelding, clearly well-trained and accustomed to his master's ways. He swung into the saddle with an easy grace that belied his size, settling into place as though he and the horse were one creature, with Zachariah riding alongside, Providing a steadying presence, they resumed their journey toward Cheyenne. The horses remained nervous but manageable, perhaps taking comfort from the calm authority of the man who rode beside them. Caroline found herself unable to stop glancing out the window at him, watching the way he sat his horse with such natural ease, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any danger. Mrs. Henderson noticed her attention and leaned close to whisper, "Quite a specimen, is he not? Those mountain men are said to be as wild as the land itself, but I must say he seems a perfect gentleman." Caroline felt her cheeks warm. "He was very brave," she murmured, not wanting to admit how much the stranger had affected her, how the memory of his strong hands steadying her made her pulse quicken. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks when the terrain finally began to level out and the first signs of civilization appeared. Scattered homesteads, then a few more buildings clustered together, and finally the outskirts of Cheyenne itself. The town had grown considerably since its founding as a Union Pacific Railroad camp a decade earlier, and now boasted several streets of businesses and homes, with more construction happening constantly. Hutchins guided the stagecoach to the depot, and Zachariah dismounted as they rolled to a stop. He was there to open the door before Hutchins had even climbed down from his perch, once again offering his hand to help Caroline descend. This time her legs were steadier, but she found herself reluctant to release his hand once her feet touched the ground. His fingers curled around hers for just a moment longer than necessary, and when she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I cannot imagine what would have happened if you had not been there." "Best not to imagine it," Zachariah replied, his voice gentle. Something in his eyes suggested he had been imagining it and did not care for those thoughts at all. "You will do well here in Cheyenne, Miss Wallace," she supplied. "Caroline Wallace." "Miss Wallace," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "I am Zachariah Coulter." "Mr. Coulter," she acknowledged, wishing she had some reason to prolong this conversation, to keep him here just a little longer. But Mrs. Henderson was calling for her, and people were gathering around the stagecoach, having heard about the near disaster from Hutchins, and the moment was slipping away. Zachariah seemed to sense it too. He released her hand slowly, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. "Good luck with your teaching, Miss Wallace. The children here are lucky to have someone willing to come all this way to educate them." Then he was turning away, moving back to his horse with that same fluid grace, and Caroline felt an unexpected pang of loss as she watched him prepare to leave. Surely she would see him again. Cheyenne was not that large a town, and he had said his cabin was not far from here. Mountain men came into town for supplies, did they not? But as Zachariah swung into his saddle and turned his horse toward the edge of town, she had the sinking feeling that he might not. He was clearly a man who preferred solitude, who had built a life in the wilderness apart from civilization. What reason would he have to return to town soon? "Caroline, dear, come along," Mrs. Henderson urged, linking her arm through Caroline's. "Let us find the boarding house where you will be staying and get you settled. You have had quite enough excitement for one day." Caroline allowed herself to be led away, though her eyes kept drifting back to the figure on horseback growing smaller in the distance. Zachariah Coulter. She repeated the name in her mind, committing it to memory along with the image of his strong, weathered face and storm-gray eyes. The boarding house was a neat two-story structure run by a pleasant woman named Mrs. Gibbs, who had been expecting Caroline and had a room ready for her. After the chaos of the day, the simple room with its clean bed and washstand felt like a sanctuary. Caroline unpacked her few belongings, carefully hanging the 2 good dresses she owned and setting out her small collection of books. Tomorrow she would meet with the school board and see the schoolhouse where she would be teaching. Tomorrow she would begin the life she had come west to build. But tonight, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of this frontier town, her thoughts kept returning to a powerful man with long dark hair and hands strong enough to stop a team of runaway horses. She had not come to Wyoming looking for romance. That had not been part of her plan at all. She had wanted independence, purpose, a chance to make something of herself beyond being some man's wife. And yet she could not deny the way her heart had responded to Zachariah Coulter, the way something had sparked to life inside her the moment his hand had closed around hers. "Stop being foolish," she told herself firmly. "You met the man for all of 20 minutes. He saved your life, and you are grateful. That is all this is. Gratitude and the natural response to a dramatic situation." But even as she thought it, she knew it was not quite the truth. There had been something in the way he looked at her, in the gentleness of his touch despite his obvious strength, in the way he had made her feel safe in a moment of utter terror. Something that suggested this was not the end of their story, but perhaps only the beginning. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Caroline dressed carefully in one of her better gowns, a deep blue calico that her mother had helped her sew before she left St. Louis. She pinned her blonde hair into a neat bun and studied her reflection in the small mirror, hoping she looked professional and capable. Her green eyes stared back at her, still holding traces of yesterday's fear but also something new. Determination, perhaps. Excitement for this fresh start. Mrs. Gibbs served a hearty breakfast, and Caroline learned that her landlady was a wealth of information about Cheyenne and its residents. The school board president, Mr. Edward Thornton, would be calling for her at 9 o'clock to escort her to the schoolhouse and discuss her duties. Mr. Thornton proved to be a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, with graying hair and a kind manner. He expressed his delight that Caroline had arrived safely and his horror when he heard about yesterday's incident. "Zachariah Coulter, you say?" Mr. Thornton mused as they walked toward the schoolhouse. "Yes, I know of him, keeps to himself mostly, but he is known as an honest man, sells his furs through Miller's trading post when he comes to town, which is not often, lives alone up in the mountains. Bit of a mystery, really. Been here about 5 years, I believe, though no one knows much about where he came from before that." Caroline absorbed this information hungrily, wanting to know more about the man who had saved her life but not wanting to appear too interested. "He seemed very capable," she said carefully. "Oh, I imagine he is. Would have to be, to survive alone in these mountains. We get hard winters here, Miss Wallace, the kind that can kill a man if he is not prepared." The schoolhouse was a single-room building with neat rows of desks and a blackboard at the front. It smelled of chalk and wood polish, and Caroline felt a surge of excitement as she imagined standing before a classroom full of eager young minds. This was what she had come for. This was her purpose. Mr. Thornton explained that she would have approximately 30 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, children of the town's merchants, railroad workers, ranchers, and homesteaders. School would begin in 2 weeks, giving her time to prepare her lessons and settle into the community. Over the next several days, Caroline threw herself into preparations. She organized the schoolroom, reviewed her teaching materials, and began to learn her way around Cheyenne. The town was rough around the edges but vibrant with possibility, full of people who had come west seeking their fortunes or fresh starts. She met shopkeepers and their wives, other young women who welcomed her warmly, families who expressed their gratitude that a qualified teacher had finally arrived. But through it all, through every new face and every warm welcome, part of her attention remained focused on the edge of town, on the mountains that rose to the north, wondering about the man who lived there alone. She found herself asking casual questions, gathering small pieces of information about Zachariah Coulter, like a magpie collecting shiny objects. She learned that he was known as a man of his word, that he had once helped track down a child who had wandered into the wilderness and gotten lost, that he occasionally worked as a guide for hunting parties, or for travelers who needed to cross difficult mountain terrain. She learned that he had been a soldier once, in the war, though no one seemed to know which side he had fought for or what had driven him into the mountains afterward. 2 weeks passed, and Caroline had not seen him again. School began, and she found herself swept up in the demanding but rewarding work of teaching her diverse group of students. Some could barely read, while others were quite advanced. She worked to meet each child where they were, to kindle in them a love of learning that would serve them throughout their lives. The older girls looked at her with admiration, whispering about how brave she was to have come all the way from St. Louis by herself. The boys tested her authority at first, until she proved herself firm but fair, willing to listen but not to be walked over. The youngest children simply soaked up her attention like flowers in the rain, hungry for the knowledge she offered. It was exhausting and fulfilling in equal measure, and Caroline fell into bed each night tired but satisfied. Yet still, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed her, her thoughts drifted to storm-gray eyes and strong hands, to a man who had appeared like something from a legend and then vanished back into the wilderness. She had almost convinced herself that she would never see Zachariah Coulter again when, on a Saturday morning in late August, she walked into Miller's trading post to purchase some supplies and found him there. He stood at the counter, his broad back to her, conducting business with Mr. Miller. He had clearly come from the mountains, his buckskin clothing worn and weathered, a large pack of furs beside him. His long dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing the strong line of his neck and shoulders. Caroline's heart leaped into her throat. For a moment she considered turning around and leaving, coming back later when he was gone. It seemed foolish now. The way she had thought about him these past weeks, the way she had built him up in her mind until he had taken on an almost mythical quality. What if he did not even remember her? But before she could retreat, Mr. Miller noticed her and called out a cheerful greeting. "Miss Wallace, good morning to you. I will be with you in just a moment." Zachariah turned and his eyes found hers across the crowded store. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening, and he nodded to her. "Miss Wallace," he said, his deep voice sending a shiver down her spine. "Good to see you well." She moved closer, her hands clutching her shopping basket perhaps too tightly. "Mr. Coulter, I did not expect to see you. That is, I am glad to see you. I never properly thanked you for what you did." "No thanks needed," he replied, but his eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "You are teaching at the school now, I hear." "Yes," Caroline said, pleased and surprised that he had heard about her, that he had perhaps asked about her as she had asked about him. "It has been wonderful. The children are bright and eager to learn." "I am sure they are learning a great deal from you," Zachariah said quietly. Something in his tone made it clear he was not simply being polite, that he genuinely meant it. Mr. Miller had finished tallying Zachariah's furs and counted out payment, which Zachariah tucked into a leather pouch at his belt. He seemed reluctant to leave, though, shifting his weight slightly and glancing at Caroline again. "Would you," he began, then paused as if the words were difficult. "Would you allow me to buy you lunch, Miss Wallace? There is a decent restaurant here in town, and I would like to hear how you are settling in, if that would be appropriate." Caroline's pulse quickened. Every rule of propriety she had been raised with told her she should refuse, that accepting such an invitation from a man she barely knew was improper. But those rules felt distant and irrelevant here in this frontier town, and more importantly, she did not want to refuse. She wanted very much to spend more time with Zachariah Coulter, to learn more about this quiet, powerful man who had occupied so many of her thoughts. "I would like that," she heard herself say. "Thank you." The restaurant was a modest establishment called the Cheyenne House, with red checked tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Zachariah held the door for her and guided her to a table near the window with a touch to her lower back that was both protective and respectful. Sitting across from him, Caroline was struck again by his sheer size. He seemed too large for the delicate chairs, too powerful for this civilized setting. Yet his manners were impeccable, and when he spoke, his deep voice was carefully modulated so as not to overwhelm her. They ordered food, simple fare but well prepared, and began to talk. At first the conversation was stilted, both of them uncertain. But gradually, as the meal progressed, they found their rhythm. Caroline told him about her students, about the satisfaction she found in teaching, about how different Cheyenne was from St. Louis, but how much she was coming to love it. Zachariah listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions, his gray eyes never wavering from her face. When it was his turn to share, he spoke carefully, as if unused to talking about himself. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands, about the rhythms of trapping and hunting and living in harmony with the wild. "Do you never get lonely?" Caroline asked, genuinely curious, "living alone like that?" Zachariah was quiet for a long moment, his strong hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I chose solitude," he said finally. "After the war I needed quiet, needed to be away from people and cities and all the noise. The mountains gave me that, gave me peace." "You fought in the war?" Caroline asked gently. "I did." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "For the Union. Saw things no man should see, did things I am not proud of. When it was over, I could not go back to who I had been before, could not pretend that life made sense anymore. So I came west and built a different life." There was pain in his words, old and deep, and Caroline felt a surge of compassion. "I think that was brave," she said softly, "to recognize what you needed and to pursue it, even if it meant being alone." Zachariah's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise there and something else. Gratitude, perhaps, for her understanding. "It was not brave," he said. "It was survival. But I have found peace in these past years, found a way to live with my memories, and now," Caroline asked, "are you still content with solitude?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Zachariah held her gaze, and Caroline felt the pull of something powerful and undeniable, a connection forming between them like a rope being woven strand by strand. "I was," he said quietly, "until about 6 weeks ago when I saw a woman with green eyes and golden hair nearly go over a cliff, and I have not been able to stop thinking about her since." Caroline's breath caught. The raw honesty in his words, the vulnerability in admitting such a thing struck her deeply. "I have thought about you too," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should, perhaps. More than I meant to. Is that improper?" Zachariah asked, and there was the faintest hint of humor in his tone, a lightness that made him seem suddenly younger. For a schoolteacher to think about a mountain man? Probably, Caroline admitted, feeling a smile tug at her lips. But I find I do not care as much about propriety as I thought I did. Coming west has changed me, I think. Or perhaps it has simply allowed me to become who I really am. They talked for hours, losing track of time completely. Zachar told her about the wildlife he encountered, about the changing seasons in the high country, about the satisfaction of living simply and relying on his own skills and strength. Caroline shared her dreams of making a real difference in her students' lives, of building something meaningful here in this growing town. When they finally left the restaurant, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Zachariah walked her back to the boarding house, his long strides shortened to match her pace, his presence beside her both thrilling and comforting. At the front steps of Mrs. Gibbs' establishment, they paused. Caroline looked up at him, this man who was still largely a mystery but who felt somehow essential, as if some part of her had been waiting for him without even knowing it. "When will you come to town again?" she asked, trying not to sound as desperate for an answer as she felt. "I do not usually come more than once every few weeks," Zachariah said honestly. "I need to stay close to my trap lines and my hunting grounds." But he paused, clearly wrestling with something internal. "I would like to see you again, Caroline, if you would permit it." He had used her given name without the formal miss, and she loved the sound of it in his deep voice. "I would like that very much," she said. "Perhaps I could write to you, if there were some way to send letters?" Zachariah shook his head slowly. "I do not have mail delivery to my cabin, but I could come to town more often. On Saturdays, perhaps, when you are not teaching." "That would be wonderful," Caroline said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Zachariah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip gentle, despite the obvious strength in those fingers. He lifted her hand and with old-fashioned courtliness pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Until next Saturday then," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not quite name. "Until then," Caroline echoed, feeling the ghost of his lips on her skin long after he had released her hand and walked away into the gathering dusk. That week seemed to crawl by with agonizing slowness. Caroline threw herself into her teaching with even more vigor than usual, trying to keep her mind occupied. But every quiet moment found her thinking of Zachariah, of the way he had looked at her across the restaurant table, of the honesty in his words, of the promise implicit in their plans to meet again. Her students noticed her distraction. Young Lucy Henderson, the daughter of the woman who had shared Caroline's terrifying stagecoach ride, gave her a knowing look and whispered to her friends, who dissolved into giggles. Caroline tried to maintain her professional composure but found herself smiling more than usual, infected by a hope she had not even known she was capable of feeling. Saturday arrived finally, bright and unseasonably warm for late August. Caroline dressed with more care than she wanted to admit, choosing her prettiest day dress, a soft green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She took extra time with her hair, pinning it in a style that was neat but softer than her usual severe bun, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Mrs. Gibbs noticed and commented with a knowing smile, but Caroline deflected her questions, not ready to share this fragile new thing with anyone else yet. She walked to the center of town at mid-morning, unsure exactly when Zachariah might arrive or where they might meet. She browsed the general store, purchased a few items she did not really need, and was beginning to feel foolish when she heard his voice behind her. "Caroline." She turned, and the sight of him drove every coherent thought from her mind. He had cleaned up, she realized, his buckskin clothing replaced with proper trousers, and a shirt that strained slightly across his broad shoulders. His hair was clean and brushed, still long but tied back neatly. He had even shaved, revealing the strong lines of his jaw. "Zachariah," she breathed, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "You came. Did you doubt I would?" he asked, moving closer. "No," she said honestly. "No, I did not doubt. But I am glad nonetheless." They fell into step together, walking with no particular destination in mind, simply wanting to be in each other's presence. Zachariah told her about his week, about tracking a mountain lion that had been getting too bold near his cabin, about the elk he had seen in the high meadows preparing for the autumn rut. Caroline shared stories about her students, about their progress and their individual personalities. As the morning stretched into afternoon, they found themselves on the outskirts of town, following a path that led alongside a creek. The water burbled over stones, creating a peaceful soundtrack to their conversation. Cottonwood trees provided dappled shade, and the air smelled of grass and wildflowers. Zachariah found a fallen log near the water's edge and gestured for Caroline to sit. He settled beside her close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. For a while, they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past. "I have not felt this way before," Zachariah said eventually, his voice quiet but intense. "Have not wanted to be near someone like this. Not since before the war, and even then it was not like this." Caroline turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "What is it like?" He met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there alongside the strength. "Like I have been living in winter for 10 years, and you are the spring thaw. Like something frozen inside me is finally warming again, and it hurts and feels wonderful all at once." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes at the raw poetry of his words. "I feel it too," she whispered. "Like I have been waiting for something without knowing what it was. And now you are here, and everything makes sense in a way it never did before." Zachariah lifted his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she did not, he cupped her cheek with his palm, his touch infinitely gentle despite the calluses on his skin. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Caroline felt herself lean into the contact, craving more of his touch. "I am not a civilized man," Zachariah said, his voice rough. "I have lived alone too long. I do not know if I can give you what you deserve, what a woman like you should have." "What is a woman like me?" Caroline challenged gently. "Educated, refined, used to comfort and society. I live in a cabin in the wilderness. I trap and hunt for my living. My hands are rough, and my ways are rough. You deserve someone who can give you a fine house and social standing and all the things a lady should have." Caroline covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm more firmly against her face. "Do you know what I left behind in St. Louis? Exactly those things you describe. A life of social calls and meaningless conversations and slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations. I came west to find something real, something meaningful. And I have found it in my teaching, yes, but also in you. In the way you speak honestly, in the strength and integrity I see in you, in the peace I feel when I am near you." Zachariah's eyes searched hers as if looking for doubt or deception. "You barely know me," he said, but there was hope in his voice now, tentative but real. "Then let me know you better," Caroline said simply. "Let me learn who you are, and you can learn who I am. We can take our time. But please do not push me away because you think I am too refined or too good for you. Let me decide what I want." Something shifted in Zachariah's expression, a wall coming down. He leaned closer, his forehead coming to rest gently against hers, his breath warm on her face. "I want to court you properly," he said, the words careful and formal. "With your permission, I want to come to town and spend time with you and show you that I can be the kind of man you might want in your life." "You already are that man," Caroline said, her own voice shaking with emotion. "But yes, I would very much like for you to court me." Zachariah pulled back just far enough to look into her eyes again, and then with infinite care he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle and chaste, barely more than a brush of contact, but it sent lightning through Caroline's entire body. His lips were soft despite the roughness of his life, and the kiss held a reverence that made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before. When he pulled away, they were both breathing unsteadily. Zachariah's hand remained on her cheek, and Caroline covered it with both of hers, not wanting to lose the contact. "I should not have done that," Zachariah said, though he did not sound particularly sorry. "Not yet, not proper. I am glad you did," Caroline replied firmly. "And as I said before, I care less about propriety than I thought I did." A slow smile spread across Zachariah's face, transforming his features and making him look years younger. "You are surprising, Caroline Wallace. I did not expect that." "Good," Caroline said, returning his smile. "I would hate to be predictable." They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking and laughing and occasionally falling into comfortable silences. As the sun began to lower, Zachariah reluctantly said he needed to start back toward his cabin. The journey would take several hours, and he wanted to make it before full dark. He walked Caroline back to the boarding house, and this time, when he took her hand to bid her farewell, he held it between both of his, warming it completely. "Next Saturday," he promised. "I will be here. I will be waiting," Caroline replied. True to his word, Zachariah appeared the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. September gave way to October, and a pattern developed. Zachariah would arrive in Cheyenne on Saturday morning, and he and Caroline would spend the day together, walking and talking, sharing meals, learning each other's hearts and minds. Caroline discovered that beneath Zachariah's quiet exterior lay a sharp intelligence and a dry wit that surprised her into laughter. He read voraciously. She learned, borrowing books from the general store when he came to town, and reading them by lamplight in his remote cabin. They debated philosophy and discussed literature, finding common ground and delightful differences in their perspectives. Zachariah, in turn, seemed fascinated by everything about Caroline. He asked endless questions about her teaching, about her students, about her life before Wyoming. He listened with complete attention when she spoke about her dreams and fears, treating her thoughts and opinions with a respect that was still novel to her. The physical attraction between them grew stronger with each passing week. Zachariah remained carefully respectful, never pushing for more than Caroline was ready to give, but she could feel the restraint in him, see the hunger in his eyes when he looked at her. And she felt it herself, this pull toward him that went beyond intellectual connection or emotional bond, a physical yearning that sometimes left her breathless. They kissed again, and then many times after that, each kiss deepening, lasting longer, until Caroline found herself clinging to his broad shoulders and feeling his strong arms wrap around her waist, pulling her against his solid body. But Zachariah always pulled back before things went too far, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking slightly as he released her. "I want to do this right," he would say, his voice rough with suppressed desire. "Want to honor you properly." And Caroline, raised with strict ideas about virtue and propriety, found herself both grateful for his restraint and frustrated by it, torn between what she had been taught and what she felt. As October deepened and the mountain peaks began to show fresh snow, reality began to intrude on their idyllic courtship. Winter was coming and Zachariah grew increasingly concerned. "The passes will close soon," he told Caroline one Saturday as they walked through town, the air crisp and cold. "Maybe another month, maybe less. Once the heavy snows come, I will not be able to make it down to Cheyenne until spring." Caroline felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming, had known that their weekly meetings could not continue indefinitely through a Wyoming winter. But hearing him say it made it real in a way that terrified her. "How long?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "How long would you be unable to come to town?" "Could be 4 months, Zachariah said grimly. "Could be 5, depending on the weather. The snow gets deep in the high country, Caroline, 10-15 feet in the passes. It is not safe to travel, and even if I tried, I would not make it through." Caroline stopped walking, turning to face him. They were on a quiet street at the edge of town, with no one nearby to overhear. "I cannot bear the thought of not seeing you for so long," she said honestly. "These past months, these Saturdays with you, they have become essential to me. I do not know how I will manage months without you." Zachariah's expression was tortured. He reached for her, pulling her close despite their public location. "I know," he said roughly. "I feel the same. These Saturdays have become everything to me. Going back to my cabin alone each night has become harder and harder. And the thought of being up there all winter, knowing you are here and I cannot reach you." He trailed off, his arms tightening around her. Caroline buried her face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the solid strength of him surrounding her. "There might be a solution," Zachariah said after a long moment, his voice carefully neutral. "But I do not know if you would consider it. Do not know if I have the right to even suggest it." Caroline pulled back to look up at him. "Tell me." Zachariah's gray eyes were intense, searching her face. "Marry me," he said simply. "Come to my cabin as my wife. We could marry before the snows come. And you could spend the winter there with me. It would not be easy. The cabin is small and basic, and the winters are hard. But we would be together." Caroline's heart leaped, but her practical mind immediately raised objections. "What about my teaching? The school? My students?" "The school closes for the winter anyway, does it not?" Zachariah said. "I have heard you mention that before. When the cold gets severe and the snow is heavy, attendance becomes impossible. You could return in the spring, resume your teaching when school starts again." It was true. The school did close during the worst of the winter, usually from December through February. Mr. Thornton had mentioned it when he hired her, explaining that the frontier children were needed at home during the hardest months, that travel to town became too difficult, that maintaining the schoolhouse's heat was too expensive. "But what would people say?" Caroline asked, even as she felt herself wanting to say yes, wanting to seize this chance with both hands. "A woman living alone with a man in the wilderness?" "We would not be living alone together," Zachariah said firmly. "We would be married, properly married by a minister, if we can find one, or by a judge if we cannot. There would be nothing improper about it." Caroline realized her heart had made the decision even before her mind caught up. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I will marry you, Zachariah." The joy that transformed his face was worth any uncertainty, any fear. He picked her up, lifting her clear off the ground as if she weighed nothing, and spun her in a circle before setting her down and kissing her with a passion that left them both shaking. "I will spend the rest of my life making you happy," Zachariah vowed, his forehead pressed to hers. I swear it, Caroline. You will never regret this choice. I know I will not, Caroline said, and she meant it with absolute certainty. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Caroline had to inform the school board of her intention to marry and her plan to leave for the winter. Mr. Thornton was surprised but ultimately supportive, congratulating her and agreeing that the school could manage with a substitute teacher through the winter months, or simply close a bit earlier than usual. Mrs. Gibbs was delighted, immediately beginning to help Caroline prepare for her wedding and her new life. The other women of Cheyenne rallied around her, several of them producing practical gifts for her new household, advice on managing life in the wilderness, and warm congratulations on her upcoming marriage. Zachariah made his own preparations, spending time in town gathering supplies they would need for the winter, purchasing items for Caroline's comfort in his cabin. He was determined that she would have everything she needed, that the transition to her new life would be as smooth as possible. They were married on a crisp morning in late October, with the mountains gleaming white against a brilliant blue sky. A circuit minister happened to be passing through Cheyenne, and he performed the ceremony in the small church at the center of town. Caroline wore her best dress, altered slightly by Mrs. Gibbs to make it more special, and carried a bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Zachariah had gathered for her that morning. Zachariah wore new clothes purchased for the occasion, dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized his powerful build. He had trimmed his hair slightly and shaved carefully, though Caroline had told him she liked his rougher appearance just fine. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachariah kissed her with such tender reverence that Caroline felt tears slip down her cheeks. His large hands cradled her face as if she were infinitely precious, and when he pulled back, his eyes were suspiciously bright as well. "My wife," he said softly, as if testing the words. Caroline Coulter, she repeated, loving the sound of her new name. "Your wife." The townspeople threw them a modest celebration at the Cheyenne house, with food and music and sincere good wishes. But both Caroline and Zachariah were eager to leave to begin their life together. They had a long journey ahead of them before dark, and Zachariah wanted to reach the cabin while there was still light. He had brought a gentle mare for Caroline to ride, along with a pack horse loaded with supplies. Caroline had said her goodbyes to Mrs. Gibbs and her students the day before, promising to return in the spring. Now, dressed in practical traveling clothes that Zachariah had helped her acquire, she mounted the mare and followed her new husband out of Cheyenne. The journey into the mountains was beautiful and challenging. The trail was steep and narrow in places, winding through towering pines and across streams running high with snowmelt. Zachariah rode ahead on his buckskin gelding, frequently turning to check on Caroline, making sure she was managing the climb. Caroline was grateful for the mare's steady temperament and for Zachariah's obvious care in choosing the animal for her. She had some experience riding from her childhood, but nothing like this, navigating mountain trails with sheer drops on one side and rocky walls on the other. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. Snow appeared in shaded areas, patches at first and then more extensive coverage. But Zachariah seemed unconcerned, guiding them with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this terrain. It was late afternoon when they finally reached a high valley, and Zachariah pointed ahead. "There," he said, pride evident in his voice. "That is home." Caroline looked where he indicated and saw the cabin. It was larger than she had expected, solidly built from thick logs, with a stone chimney from which smoke was not currently rising. It sat in a clearing beside a creek, backed by towering pines and facing south to catch the winter sun. Beyond the cabin, mountains rose on all sides, creating a sense of protective isolation. As they approached, Caroline could see that Zachariah had been working hard to prepare for her arrival. The area around the cabin was neat and organized, with a small stable for the horses, stacks of firewood under protective covers, and what looked like a root cellar dug into a hillside. Zachary dismounted and came to help Caroline down from her mare. His hands circled her waist, strong and sure, and he lifted her down as if she weighed nothing. But instead of releasing her, he held her for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "What do you think?" he asked, and she heard the vulnerability in his voice. This was his home, the life he had built, and her opinion clearly mattered deeply to him. "I think it is beautiful," Caroline said honestly. "Remote and peaceful and beautiful. I think I am going to love it here." Relief and happiness washed over Zachariah's features. He kissed her quickly, then turned to tend the horses, showing Caroline where to store the tack and how to settle the animals in the small stable. When the horses were cared for, he picked up her bags and led her to the cabin door. "I should carry you over the threshold," he said, sounding suddenly nervous. "That is traditional, is it not?" Caroline laughed softly. I believe it is, though you may have already carried me enough times today. Never enough, Zachariah said seriously. He set down her bags, then swept her up into his arms with easy strength. Caroline wrapped her arms around his neck, marveling again at how effortlessly he lifted her, at the solid warmth of his body against hers. Zachariah kicked the door open and carried her inside, not setting her down until they were well over the threshold. The cabin's interior was dim, lit only by the fading daylight coming through the windows. Zachariah moved to light a lamp and warm light filled the space. Caroline looked around with curious interest. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. There was a stone fireplace that clearly served for both heating and cooking, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies and books, a few pieces of simple furniture. Everything was scrupulously clean and well organized, speaking to Zachariah's self-sufficient nature. But Caroline noticed touches that had clearly been added recently for her benefit. Fresh curtains at the windows, a colorful blanket on the bed in the loft, wildflowers in a jar on the table despite the lateness of the season. Zachariah had tried to make the space more welcoming, more appropriate for a wife, and Caroline felt her heart swell with love for this thoughtful, careful man. It is not much, Zachariah said, watching her anxiously. But it is solid and warm. I built it to withstand the winters, so you will be safe here. And in the spring, if you want, we can add on. Make it larger, more comfortable. Caroline turned to him, seeing the uncertainty in his strong face. This powerful man who had stopped a team of runaway horses, who survived alone in the wilderness, who feared nothing that nature could throw at him, was nervous about whether his home would please her. The realization was endearing and touching. Zachariah, she said softly, moving close to him. This is perfect. It is more than I expected. You have made it lovely for me, and I can see that. I do not need a grand house or fine things. I just need you. The tension left his shoulders, and he reached for her, pulling her against his chest. I want to make you happy, he said, his voice muffled in her hair. Want to give you everything you deserve. You already do, Caroline assured him, tilting her head back to look up at him. You give me your honesty, your respect, your care. You give me yourself. That is everything I need. Zachariah's eyes darkened with emotion, and when he kissed her this time it was different. The restraint he had maintained throughout their courtship was gone, replaced by a hunger that matched her own. His arms tightened around her, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head as he deepened the kiss. Caroline responded with equal passion, her hands gripping his shoulders, feeling the powerful muscles bunch beneath her fingers. They were married now. This was their wedding night, and suddenly all the anticipation of the past months seemed to culminate in this moment, in this kiss that promised so much more. Zachariah pulled back, breathing hard. Caroline, he said roughly, if you need time, if you are not ready, we can wait. I do not want to rush you. Caroline smiled, touched by his consideration even in the midst of obvious desire. I do not want to wait, she said clearly. I want you, Zachariah. I want to be your wife in every way. Something primal flashed in his gray eyes. He kissed her again, his hands beginning to move over her body with careful exploration. Caroline had no experience beyond kisses, but her body seemed to know what to do, responding to his touch with instinctive eagerness. Zachariah led her to the ladder that accessed the loft, and they climbed up to where a large, comfortable bed waited, covered in soft furs and the new blanket he had purchased. The sloped roof created a cozy, intimate space, and through the small window, Caroline could see the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. What followed was tender and passionate, awkward in moments as they learned each other, but ultimately beautiful. Zachariah was gentle despite his size and strength, attentive to Caroline's needs and responses, and Caroline gave herself to him without reservation, trusting him completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the furs, Caroline's head on Zachariah's broad chest, his arm wrapped securely around her. She could hear his heartbeat beneath her ear, strong and steady, and felt utterly content. I love you, Zachariah said into the darkness, his deep voice rumbling through his chest. I did not think I could feel this way again, did not think I deserved to. But I love you, Caroline, more than I can properly express. I love you too, Caroline said, lifting her head to kiss his jaw. I think I started loving you the moment you jumped onto those horses, or maybe the moment you looked at me afterward with such relief in your eyes. I am not sure, but I know that I have never been happier than I am right now. Zachariah tightened his arm around her, holding her close as if she were infinitely precious. I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me, he vowed. I could never regret it, Caroline assured him. You are everything I did not know I was searching for. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the mountain wind singing softly outside, while inside the cabin all was warm and safe. The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their new life together. Caroline quickly adapted to the routines of the cabin, learning to cook on the fireplace, to manage the supplies, to help with the daily tasks required for survival in such a remote location. Zachariah was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, and he seemed to take genuine pleasure in sharing his knowledge with her. They worked together to prepare for the deep winter ahead. Zachariah took Caroline with him to check his trap lines, teaching her to read signs in the forest, to move quietly, to observe and understand the wilderness around them. She proved to be an apt student, her natural intelligence and eagerness to learn serving her well. In turn, Caroline brought elements of her own world into the cabin. She read aloud to Zachariah in the evenings, her clear voice filling the space with stories and poetry. They discussed the books, debating ideas and interpretations, and Caroline discovered that Zachariah had depths of thought she was still uncovering, layers to his intelligence that surprised and delighted her. The physical intimacy between them deepened as well. Now that they were married and living together, they explored each other without restraint, learning what brought pleasure, growing more comfortable and confident. Zachariah continued to be gentle and attentive, but Caroline discovered that beneath his careful control was a passionate nature that matched her own. She also learned more about the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. On his body were marks from the war, old wounds that had healed but left their traces, and in quiet moments when he thought she was asleep, she sometimes heard him murmur in the grip of bad dreams, reliving battles she could only imagine. But those episodes grew less frequent as the weeks passed, as if her presence was helping to heal those old wounds, bringing him peace in a way solitude never quite had. The first heavy snow came in mid-November, falling steadily for 3 days until the world outside the cabin was transformed into a white wonderland. The drifts piled high against the walls, and the temperature dropped to levels that made Caroline grateful for Zachariah's preparations and for the solid construction of the cabin. They were truly isolated now, cut off from Cheyenne and the rest of the world. But Caroline did not feel trapped. Instead, she felt cocooned, safe in this small warm space with the man she loved, protected from the harsh elements by thick walls and careful planning. Zachariah checked his trap lines when the weather permitted, sometimes gone for several hours, and Caroline learned to manage her worry during his absences. He always returned safely, often with fresh meat or valuable furs, and she would greet him with relief and love, helping him warm up by the fire. The winters stretched on and Christmas came and went, marked by small gifts they had made for each other, and a special meal Caroline prepared. Zachariah carved her a beautiful wooden box for her few precious possessions, and Caroline had sewn him a shirt from fabric she had brought from town, fitting it to his large frame with careful stitches. They celebrated the new year of 1879 together, talking late into the night about their hopes and dreams, about the future they would build together. Zachariah spoke tentatively about perhaps building a larger cabin, about maybe raising a family if Caroline wanted that. Caroline assured him she did want it, wanted children with him, wanted to build a life that was rich and full even if it was simple and remote. January was brutally cold, with temperatures that made it dangerous to be outside for long. They stayed close to the cabin during the worst of it, and Caroline was grateful for Zachariah's company, for his stories and his warmth and his steady presence. They played simple games, read all the books they had twice over, and talked endlessly, learning every detail of each other's pasts and dreams. It was during one of those long January nights, curled together under the furs, that Caroline first suspected she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had not come when expected, and she had been feeling slightly queasy in the mornings. She said nothing to Zachariah at first, wanting to be more certain before raising his hopes or worrying him. But by early February, she was sure. The signs were unmistakable, and a quiet joy began to build in her chest. She was carrying Zachariah's child, a new life created from their love, growing inside her even as the winter raged outside. She chose her moment carefully, waiting for an evening when Zachariah seemed particularly relaxed and content. They had just finished dinner, and he was adding wood to the fire while Caroline cleared away the dishes. When she joined him by the hearth, settling into his arms as he sat in the sturdy chair he had made, she took a deep breath. "Zachariah," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked down at her, immediately attentive. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," Caroline assured him quickly, smiling at his instant concern. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is very, very right. I am pregnant, Zachariah. We are going to have a baby." For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression frozen in shock. Then understanding dawned. followed by a joy so profound it transformed his entire face. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby, yes," Caroline confirmed, laughing at his stunned happiness. "Probably sometime in late summer or early fall if I am calculating correctly." Zachariah's arms tightened around her, gentle despite their strength, cradling her as if she had suddenly become infinitely fragile. "A baby," he repeated, seeming unable to process the news fully. "Caroline, I do not have words. I am so happy, so grateful." Tears were running down his weathered cheeks, and Caroline reached up to wipe them away with tender fingers. "I am happy too," she said. "I was not planning for this to happen so soon, but now that it has, I cannot imagine anything more perfect." "I will take care of you," Zachariah vowed, his voice intense. "Both of you. I will make sure you have everything you need, that you are safe and healthy." "I swear it, Caroline. I know you will," Caroline said, touched by his fierce protectiveness. "I am not worried, not with you here." Zachariah pressed his large hand gently to her still flat stomach, wonder in his eyes. "Our child," he said softly. "A piece of you and me combined. I cannot quite believe it. You will have 9 months to get used to the idea," Caroline teased gently. "Well, closer to 7 now, I suppose." For the rest of that evening and many evenings after, Zachariah could not seem to stop touching her belly, marveling at the life growing there even though there were no visible changes yet. His protectiveness, already strong, intensified to the point where Caroline sometimes had to gently remind him that she was not made of glass. But she loved his care, loved the way he constantly made sure she was warm enough, fed enough, rested enough. He took on even more of the physical tasks around the cabin, insisting she save her strength for the baby. And at night he would hold her close, his hand resting on her stomach, talking softly to the child they had created. February gave way to March, and slowly, gradually, the grip of winter began to loosen. The days grew longer, the temperatures slightly less bitter. Snow still fell, but it melted more quickly now, and there were occasional days when the sun shone with real warmth. Zachariah began to prepare for the return to Cheyenne. The passes would not be fully clear until April at the earliest, but he wanted to be ready when the time came. Caroline found herself with mixed feelings about leaving. The cabin had become home in a way she had not expected, and she had loved this time of isolation with Zachariah, this cocoon of safety and love. But she also missed her students, missed her teaching, and she knew they needed to return to civilization for practical reasons. She would need a doctor as her pregnancy progressed, and they needed to replenish supplies and reconnect with the community. In late March, Zachariah made an exploratory trip down toward the lower elevations, checking the condition of the trails. He was gone for a full day, and Caroline worried despite knowing he was perfectly capable. When he returned, he reported that the way was becoming passable, though still challenging in places. Another few weeks, he estimated. "By mid-April, we should be able to make it through safely, and I want to get you down before you get any further along. The ride is rough, and I do not want to risk your health or the baby's." Caroline agreed, though part of her wanted to stay in their mountain haven forever, away from the complications and expectations of town life. But she knew that was not practical, and she had responsibilities waiting for her in Cheyenne. They made the journey in mid-April, taking it slowly and carefully, camping one night in a protected valley before completing the trip the second day. The trails were indeed challenging, muddy and treacherous in places, but Zachariah guided them with his usual competence, and they arrived in Cheyenne without incident. The town welcomed them back warmly. Mrs. Gibbs was delighted to see Caroline, and immediately offered them a room at the boarding house for as long as they needed it. Mr. Thornton and the school board were pleased to have her back, though Caroline explained she would need to leave her position before the baby came. To Caroline's surprise, several of the town's women organized a gathering in her honor, welcoming her back and congratulating her on her pregnancy. She received advice, some of it contradictory, and offers of help when the time came for the baby to arrive. The sense of community, of belonging, warmed her heart. Zachariah was less comfortable in town, she noticed. He seemed restless and out of place, too large for the civilized buildings and streets, his mountain ways at odds with the social niceties expected here. But he bore it with patient good humor for her sake, attending social functions when required, and dealing with the curious stares and questions from townspeople who were fascinated by the mountain man who had married their school teacher. They established a routine over the following months. Caroline returned to her teaching, though she knew she would have to stop when her pregnancy became too advanced. Zachariah found work as a guide for hunters and travelers, using his intimate knowledge of the mountains to earn money. He also continued to sell furs through the trading post, bringing in a steady income. They rented a small house on the edge of town, giving them more space and privacy than the boarding house could offer. It was modest but comfortable, and Caroline enjoyed having a home to manage, a space that was truly theirs. As spring deepened into summer, Caroline's pregnancy became visible. Her belly swelled with the growing child, and she felt the first flutters of movement that gradually strengthened into distinct kicks. Zachariah was fascinated by every change, constantly touching her rounded stomach and marveling when he could feel the baby move. The doctor in Cheyenne, an older man named Dr. Morrison, examined Caroline regularly and pronounced her healthy and progressing normally. He estimated the baby would arrive in early September, which aligned with Caroline's own calculations. As summer progressed, Caroline had to stop teaching. It became too difficult to stand for long periods, and the heat made her uncomfortable. She missed her students but was also ready for a rest, ready to focus on preparing for the baby's arrival. The women of Cheyenne rallied around her again, organizing a gathering where they brought gifts for the baby and shared their own experiences of childbirth. Caroline listened to their stories with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The process sounded painful and dangerous, but also miraculous and worthwhile. Zachariah grew increasingly protective as Caroline's due date approached. He hovered constantly, wanting to ensure she had everything she needed, worrying about every twinge or discomfort she felt. Caroline found it endearing even when it became slightly overwhelming. In late August, with the baby due any day, Zachariah made a decision. "I want to take you back to the cabin," he said one evening, his voice firm. "I want our child to be born there in our home." Caroline looked at him in surprise. "But the doctor is here, and the women who have offered to help. Would it not be safer to stay in town?" "Dr. Morrison can come with us," Zachariah argued, "or Mrs. Gibbs, who has delivered many babies. But I want our child born in the place we made our home, Caroline, away from the noise and crowds, in the peace of the mountains. And I want to be sure you are somewhere I can protect you both, somewhere I know every inch of the surroundings." Caroline considered his words. Part of her thought it was a crazy idea to go into the wilderness right before giving birth, but another part of her loved it, loved the idea of their child entering the world in that peaceful valley, surrounded by the mountains that had sheltered their love. "All right," she said finally, "but only if Dr. Morrison agrees to come with us. I will not risk the baby's safety or mine for romanticism." Dr. Morrison, when consulted, was surprisingly agreeable. "I have delivered babies in far worse conditions than a well-supplied mountain cabin," he said pragmatically, "and if Mr. Coulter thinks you will be more comfortable there, that matters. A calm mother has an easier labor. We can leave whenever you are ready." They made the journey 5 days later, taking it even more slowly than before, with Caroline riding in a small wagon Zachariah had borrowed for the purpose. Dr. Morrison rode alongside on his own horse, his medical bag securely fastened, and Mrs. Gibbs had insisted on coming as well, bringing her own experience and steady presence. It took them 3 days to reach the cabin, encamping at night under the stars, and Caroline felt a sense of homecoming when the familiar clearing finally came into view. Zachariah had ridden ahead the previous week to open the cabin and prepare it, and everything was clean and ready. They settled in, and Caroline found herself relaxing in a way she had not been able to in town. The peace of the mountains seeped into her bones, calming her nerves about the coming birth. Dr. Morrison set up his instruments and supplies, and Mrs. Gibbs took over the cooking, giving Caroline time to rest and prepare mentally. 3 days after their arrival, as the sun was setting and painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Caroline felt the first unmistakable contraction. She had been having false starts for days, but this was different. This was real. "Zachariah," she called, her voice steady despite the tightening sensation in her belly. "I think it is time." What followed was long and difficult, as childbirth often is. Through the night and into the next day, Caroline labored with Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Gibbs guiding her, and Zachariah holding her hand, his face pale but his presence unwavering. He did not leave her side even when Mrs. Gibbs suggested he might prefer to wait outside, as many men did. "I am staying with my wife," he said firmly, and Caroline was grateful for his steady presence, for the anchor of his strong hand in hers. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith on the second day, with a final tremendous effort, Caroline pushed their child into the world. The baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy, and Dr. Morrison announced, "You have a son, a fine, healthy boy, a son." Caroline collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but elated, and Zachariah leaned down to kiss her forehead, his eyes bright with tears. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought our son into the world. You are amazing, Caroline." Mrs. Gibbs cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Caroline's arms. Caroline looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair, the small fists waving, and felt a love so overwhelming it took her breath away. This was their child, hers and Zachariah's, a perfect combination of them both. "He is beautiful," she whispered, touching the baby's soft cheek. Zachariah reached out with one large, gentle finger to stroke his son's head, wonder written across his face. "He is perfect," he said in awe. "Absolutely perfect." They named him James after Zachariah's father, with the middle name Alexander. James Alexander Coulter, their son. The beginning of their family, the weeks following James's birth, were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, of learning to care for this tiny, demanding creature. But Caroline had never been happier. Watching Zachariah with their son was a revelation. This powerful, solitary man became infinitely gentle when holding the baby, his massive hands cradling the small body with exquisite care, his deep voice softening when he talked to James. Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Gibbs stayed for 2 weeks to ensure both Caroline and the baby were healthy before making the journey back to Cheyenne. Before they left, Dr. Morrison pronounced both mother and child thriving, and Mrs. Gibbs hugged Caroline tightly, congratulating her on her fine son and her fine husband. Alone again with Zachariah and James, Caroline settled into the rhythms of new motherhood. The cabin that had once seemed small now felt cozy and perfect, filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and coos, with the quiet conversations between parents, with lullabies sung in the mountain stillness. As James grew, reaching each new milestone, Caroline marveled at the life they had built. It was not the life she had imagined in St. Louis, teaching in a city school and living a conventional existence. It was so much better. It was real and raw and beautiful, filled with love and purpose, and the daily satisfactions of living close to the land. They returned to Cheyenne in the spring after James's birth, when he was 6 months old and sturdy enough for the journey. Caroline had decided not to return to teaching full-time, wanting to focus on raising their son, but she offered to tutor students who needed extra help, working from their home. Zachariah continued his work as a guide and trapper, but he was more selective now, unwilling to be away from Caroline and James for long periods. They had enough money saved and enough income from his work that they could manage comfortably. Over the next few years, their life found its balance. They spent summers in Cheyenne, where Caroline enjoyed the social connections and Zachariah tolerated town life for her sake and for James's socialization. Come autumn, they would return to the mountain cabin, spending the winters in the peaceful isolation that both of them had come to love. James thrived in both environments, growing into a sturdy, bright boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Zachariah taught him to ride, to track, to understand the wilderness, while Caroline taught him to read and write and think critically about the world. When James was 3 years old, Caroline became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and when her time came, she insisted on staying in Cheyenne where Dr. Morrison could attend her. Their daughter was born in October of 1882, a small, fierce girl they named Elizabeth after Caroline's mother. Where James had been placid and easy, Elizabeth was demanding and determined from the start, making her preferences known with volume and persistence. Zachariah was completely charmed by his daughter, this tiny creature who already had him wrapped around her little finger. He carried her everywhere, talking to her constantly, and Caroline often found them together. Zachariah's massive frame bent protectively over Elizabeth's small form. 2 children made life busier and more chaotic, but also richer. The cabin had to be expanded, and Zachariah spent a summer building an addition with space for the children and for storage. Their house in Cheyenne was also improved, giving them more room for their growing family. As the children grew older, Caroline sometimes reflected on the moment that had changed her life, that terrifying instant when the stagecoach horses bolted toward the cliff, and she thought her life was ending. If not for Zachariah's courage and quick action, she would have died that day, never knowing the love and fulfillment that waited for her. She told this story to James and Elizabeth when they were old enough to understand, wanting them to know how their parents had met, how one moment of bravery had led to everything that followed. The children loved hearing about it, begging for details, and Zachariah would shake his head modestly, insisting he had just done what anyone would have done. But Caroline knew better. Not just anyone could have done what Zachariah did that day. It had taken extraordinary skill and courage, the kind that defined who he was at his core, and she was grateful every single day that he had been there, that he had risked himself to save strangers, that his life had intersected with hers in such a dramatic way. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. They lost a 3rd child, a son born too early one harsh winter, and mourned together in the privacy of their mountain cabin. But the following year brought another pregnancy, and this time a healthy boy they named Samuel joined their family. The three children grew up splitting their time between mountain and town, becoming fluent in both worlds. James showed signs of wanting to follow in his father's footsteps, drawn to the wilderness and the freedom it represented. Elizabeth was fiercely independent and announced at age 8 that she intended to become a doctor like Dr. Morrison, who had delivered her. Samuel was still too young to show clear preferences, but he adored his older siblings and followed them everywhere. Zachariah's hair began to show threads of gray at the temples, and lines deepened around Caroline's eyes. But their love for each other only grew stronger with time. They had weathered storms together, literal and metaphorical, and had built something solid and lasting. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888, Zachariah took Caroline back to the spot where he had stopped the runaway stagecoach. It was a warm October day, and they left the children with Mrs. Gibbs in town for the afternoon. They rode together to that dangerous mountain pass, and Zachariah dismounted, helping Caroline down from her horse. "This is where I first saw you," he said, standing at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast valley below. "Right here, when I came around that bend and saw the stage about to go over. My heart stopped, Caroline. I thought I was going to watch people die, and I could not let that happen." "You saved us all," Caroline said softly, standing beside him and slipping her hand into his. "But you saved me in more ways than just preventing that crash. You saved me from a life of quiet desperation. You gave me purpose and love and a family. You gave me everything." Zachariah turned to look at her, his storm-gray eyes as intense as they had been 10 years ago. "You saved me too," he said seriously. "I was living, but I was not really alive, just existing, hiding from the world and my own pain. You brought me back to life, Caroline. You made me want to be part of the world again, made me believe I deserved happiness." Caroline reached up to touch his weathered face, this man who was everything to her. "We saved each other," she said, "and we built something beautiful together." Zachariah pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with the same strength and gentleness they always had. They stood like that for a long time, on the edge of the cliff where their story had begun, looking out at the mountains and valleys that had become their home. Eventually they rode back to Cheyenne, back to their children and their life, but Caroline carried the moment with her. The reminder of how far they had come, how much they had built together. The years continued to roll forward, bringing gradual changes. James grew into a young man, tall and powerfully built like his father, with a quiet confidence that made him a natural leader. At 18, he announced his intention to become a guide and trapper, and Zachariah spent a year teaching him everything he knew, passing on skills and knowledge accumulated over decades. Elizabeth was 15 and already working as an assistant to Dr. Morrison when she had time, learning medicine with the same determination she brought to everything else. She had her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness, a combination that made her formidable. Samuel, at 12, was still finding his path, but he showed an interest in ranching and talked about starting his own spread someday. Caroline had returned to teaching part-time, taking on students in her home and finding joy in shaping young minds. Zachariah continued to work as needed, though he was more selective about the jobs he took, preferring to spend time with his family. Their mountain cabin had become a beloved retreat, a place where the whole family gathered each winter, reconnecting with each other and with the land. Caroline had come to love those winters as much as Zachariah did, appreciating the enforced closeness, the simplicity, the peace. In the winter of 1895, with James 20 and preparing to set out on his own, Elizabeth 17 and determined to attend medical school in the East, and Samuel 13 and growing like a weed, Caroline and Zachariah found themselves alone in the cabin for a few weeks while the children visited friends in Cheyenne. It was strange at first, being just the two of them again after so many years of children underfoot. But it was also wonderful, a reminder of those early days when they had discovered each other in this very cabin, when their love was new and consuming. They sat by the fire one evening, Caroline leaning against Zachariah's chest as they watched the flames dance, and she reflected on the fullness of her life. She had come west seeking something, though she had not known quite what. Adventure, perhaps. Purpose. A chance to be more than what society expected of her. She had found all of that and so much more. She had found a love that sustained her through every challenge, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. She had found purpose in her teaching and in raising her children. She had found a home in these mountains, in this life she never could have imagined back in St. Louis. "What are you thinking?" Zachariah asked, his deep voice rumbling through his chest beneath her ear. "I am thinking about how happy I am," Caroline said honestly. "How grateful. That stagecoach almost killed me, but instead it brought me to you. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had not been there that day." if you had not jumped onto those horses." Zachariah's arms tightened around her. "Do not think about it," he said firmly. "I was there. I did jump. And I would do it again 1,000 times, because it brought you into my life." "I love you," Caroline said, turning in his arms to look up at him. "After all these years, through everything, I love you more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," Zachariah replied, lowering his head to kiss her with a tenderness that still had the power to make her heart race. "Always have, always will. You are my heart, Caroline. You and our children, you are everything that matters." They stayed up late that night, talking and holding each other, celebrating the life they had built together. And when they finally climbed to the loft and the bed they had shared for so many years, Caroline felt utterly content, utterly at peace. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Coulter family continued to thrive. James established himself as a highly regarded guide, eventually courting and marrying a rancher's daughter who was as comfortable in the wilderness as he was. Elizabeth did go east for medical school, becoming one of the few female doctors in the territory when she returned to set up practice in Cheyenne. Samuel fulfilled his dream of starting a ranch, building it into a successful operation through hard work and smart management. Through it all, through weddings and grandchildren, through the inevitable losses that come with age, Caroline and Zachariah remained each other's anchor. They grew old together gracefully, their bodies showing the marks of hard living and hard work, but their love remaining as strong as ever. On a summer evening in 1910, sitting on the porch of their Cheyenne house with their grandchildren playing in the yard, Caroline looked at Zachariah and smiled. His hair was completely gray now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still that same storm gray. And when he looked at her, she still saw the man who had risked his life to save hers all those years ago. "No regrets?" Zachariah asked, reaching over to take her hand in his. "Not a single one," Caroline replied firmly. "This life, this family, it is all more than I ever dreamed possible. I am the luckiest woman alive." "I am the lucky one," Zachariah countered with a smile. "You took a chance on a rough mountain man who barely knew how to live among people anymore. You gave me everything I did not know I needed." Their eldest grandson, James's boy, came running up to the porch at that moment, breathless and excited. "Grandpa, will you tell us the story again? About how you saved Grandma from the runaway stage?" Zachariah laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Have you not heard that story 100 times already?" "Yes. But we want to hear it again," the boy insisted, and his siblings and cousins echoed the sentiment. So Zachariah told the story once more, his deep voice painting a picture of that dramatic day, and Caroline watched the children's faces as they hung on every word. She was grateful that this story would be passed down through the generations, that their great-grandchildren would someday hear about the day their great-grandfather jumped onto a team of runaway horses and saved not just lives, but also created the possibility for all of this family, this love, this legacy. When the story ended and the children ran off to play again, Caroline leaned her head on Zachariah's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, his arm coming around her shoulders. "For being brave that day, for stopping those horses, for opening your heart to me despite your fear, for giving me this beautiful life." Zachariah pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for saying yes," he replied, "for taking a chance on me, for loving me, for building this life with me. You are and always will be my greatest adventure, Caroline Coulter." As the sun set over the mountains to the west, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold, Caroline reflected that adventure could take many forms. It did not always mean dramatic rescues or dangerous situations, though their relationship had certainly started with both. Sometimes the greatest adventure was simply choosing to love, choosing to commit, choosing to build a life with another person and see where that journey led. She had come west seeking something beyond the ordinary, and she had found it in the most unexpected way. In a mountain man with storm-gray eyes and gentle hands, in a cabin in the wilderness and a growing family, in a love that had sustained them through decades and would continue to sustain them for whatever years remained. The Stagecoach horses had been spooked near the cliff all those years ago, and Zachariah had jumped onto the team to stop them. That single moment of courage and quick thinking had changed both their lives forever, setting them on a path neither could have predicted, but both were grateful to have traveled. And as Caroline sat there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the sounds of her grandchildren playing, and the solid warmth of her husband beside her, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing about the life they had built together. Every challenge, every joy, every moment had been worth it, had led them to this place of contentment and love. Their story had started with danger and drama, with a near-death experience on a mountain pass. but it had become something quieter and more enduring, a testament to the power of love and commitment, to the beauty of two people choosing each other day after day, year after year, through everything life brought them. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, silent witnesses to the passage of time and the endurance of love. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Caroline squeezed Zachariah's hand and felt him squeeze back, a simple gesture that spoke of decades of understanding, of partnership, of love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. This was their happily ever after, not perfect but perfect for them, built on a foundation of courage and trust and abiding love. And Caroline knew that when future generations told the story of how Zachariah Coulter jumped onto a team of runaway horses to save a stagecoach full of passengers, they would be telling a love story as much as an adventure story. Because that single act of bravery had not just saved lives, it had made possible all the love and family and happiness that followed. And that, Caroline thought as she watched the first stars emerge, was the greatest gift of all. Not just being saved, but being loved, being chosen, being partners in building a life that mattered. That was the true miracle of that long-ago day when the stagecoach horses spooked near the cliff, and a mountain man proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not just save a life, but open your heart.